The flight attendant's hand connected with Zoe's shoulder, the impact causing coffee to spill across her designer suit. "You don't belong in first class," he hissed. The cabin fell silent as Zoe slowly stood up, revealing the pilot wings pinned to her chest. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed discrimination in public, and subscribe to hear more true stories of justice and redemption. Now, let's rewind to see how this explosive moment came to be. Captain Zoe Washington had been awake for nearly 20 hours straight. Her fingers still trembled slightly from the adrenaline that had coursed through her body yesterday when she'd safely landed Flight 302 after hydraulic failure threatened to send 157 souls plummeting from the sky. The headlines called her a hero. Sterling Airways called her invaluable. Yet as she boarded Flight 1872 from Atlanta to San Francisco in civilian clothes, she felt invisible. "Boarding pass, ma'am." The gate agent's eyes flicked from her ticket to her face with thinly veiled surprise. "First class is to your left." Zoe nodded politely, used to the reaction. At 35, she'd spent over a decade watching people's expressions shift when they realized she, a black woman, was their pilot. Sometimes it was surprise, sometimes concern, occasionally outright fear. She'd learned to let it roll off her back like water. Today, all she wanted was to reach San Francisco in time for her sister Kendra's wedding. Their relationship had been strained for years, filled with missed birthdays and holidays as Zoe climbed the ranks in commercial aviation. This wedding was her chance to reconnect, to prove that her absence hadn't been a rejection of family, but a necessary sacrifice to break barriers in an industry that had never welcomed people who looked like her. As a child, she'd announced her dream of becoming a pilot during a fourth-grade career day. Her teacher had smiled condescendingly and suggested flight attendant instead. "More realistic," she'd said. Her father had squeezed her shoulder that night and whispered, "Remember, Zoe Bird, you'll need to be twice as good to get half as far. But you can do it." Zoe made her way down the jetway, rolling her small carry-on behind her. She felt the familiar weight of eyes tracking her movement as she stepped onto the aircraft. A businessman in a charcoal suit shifted slightly away as she passed. A woman clutched her purse tighter. Small things. Almost imperceptible. Almost. She found seat 2A and settled in, placing her bag in the overhead compartment. The leather seat felt luxurious after 20 hours of tension, and she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She pulled out her tablet, opening the detailed itinerary Kendra had sent weeks ago. Rehearsal dinner tomorrow night. Wedding on Saturday. So much family to face after so long away. Is this seat taken? Zoe looked up to find an elderly white gentleman with kind eyes gesturing to 2B. Not at all, she replied with a small smile. James Peterson, he offered, extending his hand after stowing his bag. Zoe Washington, she replied, shaking it firmly. Heading to San Francisco for business or pleasure, he asked, easing into his seat with the careful movements of someone managing arthritic joints. Family wedding, she answered. My sister's. In seat 1A, a man in an impeccably tailored suit tapped aggressively at his phone, occasionally barking instructions to someone on the other end. His gold cufflinks caught the light as he gestured dismissively toward the flight attendants preparing the cabin. Calvin Reed, according to the luggage tag visible on his briefcase, clearly considered himself the most important person on the plane. The flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin. Trina Martinez, whose name tag included a small rainbow pin, offered warm smiles as she verified seatbelts and overhead bins. Behind her, Bradley Wilson, the senior flight attendant identifiable by the 3 stripes on his sleeve, maintained a professional demeanor that bordered on cold. Good morning, Trina said warmly as she reached Zoe's row. Welcome aboard. Bradley, passing behind her, barely glanced in Zoe's direction before thoroughly welcoming James and the passengers across the aisle. As the safety demonstration began, Zoe closed her eyes briefly. The familiar words washed over her, she could recite them in her sleep. She'd delivered them countless times herself. Today, she was just a passenger. Just a woman trying to get home to family. The engines rumbled to life, and Zoe felt the familiar push back into her seat as the plane began to taxi. Little did she know that this routine flight was about to become anything but ordinary. The seatbelt sign dinged off 30 minutes after takeoff, and the first-class cabin hummed with activity as flight attendants prepared the initial beverage service. Zoe had pulled out her tablet again, reviewing her speech for the wedding reception while trying to ignore the fatigue seeping into her bones. "Coffee, please," she requested when Bradley approached with his cart. "Black with cream on the side, if possible." Bradley nodded curtly without making eye contact, continuing down the aisle to Calvin Reed in 1A. "Good morning, sir. What can I get for you today?" "Bloody Mary, easy on the ice," Calvin replied without looking up from his spreadsheet. "And make it strong. I've got a board meeting to prepare for." "Of course, sir. Right away." Bradley's tone shifted dramatically, warm and accommodating where it had been cold and dismissive with Zoe. Trina worked the other aisle, chatting pleasantly with passengers as she distributed drinks and warm nuts. She caught Zoe's eye briefly, her expression flickering with something like apology before she turned away. Bradley returned several minutes later, carefully placing Calvin's Bloody Mary on his tray table along with a linen napkin and dish of mixed nuts. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "This is fine," Calvin muttered, taking an immediate sip. Bradley continued serving other passengers, completely bypassing Zoe. When he finished with the row behind her, she raised her hand slightly. "Excuse me, I ordered coffee a while ago." "I'll get to it when I can, ma'am," Bradley replied without pausing, moving on to the next row. From seat 1A, Calvin Reed snorted quietly. "Affirmative action passengers," he murmured, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "They'll let anyone in first class these days." Zoe's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. This wasn't her first encounter with prejudice, and confrontation rarely improved situations like this. She could see Trina watching from the galley, concern evident in her expression, but the younger flight attendant made no move to intervene. 10 minutes passed. 15. Every passenger in first class had been served except Zoe. She watched as Bradley refilled drinks, offered additional nuts, and checked repeatedly on Calvin Reed's comfort. When Bradley passed by again, Zoe spoke up more firmly. "Excuse me, I still haven't received my coffee." Bradley stopped, his expression shifting to one of practiced confusion. "Coffee? Are you sure you ordered from me?" "Yes, I'm sure," Zoe replied evenly. "Black with cream on the side." "Let me check your seat assignment," Bradley said, his tone implying suspicion. "Which seat were you assigned?" 2A, the one I'm sitting in." Several passengers glanced over now, the exchange beginning to draw attention. James Peterson frowned slightly beside her. "May I see your boarding pass?" Bradley asked. Zoe pulled it from her bag and handed it over, maintaining her composure despite the humiliation of having her right to be there questioned. Bradley examined the boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, turning it over as though checking for counterfeit markings. "This seems unusual. We don't typically have. I mean, there must have been an upgrade or something." "I purchased this ticket directly," Zoe stated firmly. "Is there a problem?" "I'll need to see some ID," Bradley demanded, something he hadn't requested from any other passenger. Calvin Reed smirked visibly now, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Two passengers across the aisle exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. Zoe felt a familiar heat rising in her chest, the same feeling she'd experienced during flight school when instructors scrutinized her performance more harshly than her male colleagues, when passengers had requested different pilots upon seeing her, when colleagues had asked if she was really qualified, or just a diversity hire. She reached for her wallet and extracted her driver's license, handing it over with dignity intact despite the public humiliation. Bradley made a show of comparing the ID to her face and the boarding pass. "Well, this all seems to be in order, though I'm not sure how you ended up in first class." Perhaps you found this boarding pass. The accusation hung in the air. Several passengers were now openly watching the confrontation unfold. James Peterson shifted uncomfortably beside her. Are you accusing me of stealing someone's boarding pass? Zoe asked, her voice level but with an edge that hadn't been there before. I'm simply trying to understand how you ended up in this section, Bradley replied with false innocence. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable returning to your actual seat in economy? Zoe's mind flashed to her father's words, twice as good to get half as far. To every door that had been shut in her face. To every time she'd been told, explicitly or implicitly, that she didn't belong. My seat is right here, she stated firmly. And I would like my coffee, please. Bradley's expression hardened. I think there's been a mistake with your seating assignment. Let me help you find your proper place. He reached out, his hand landing firmly on her shoulder with enough force to push her slightly back into her seat. The coffee he'd finally brought splashed across the front of her designer suit, leaving a dark stain across the cream-colored fabric. You don't belong in first class, he hissed, low enough that only those in immediate proximity could hear the words, but loud enough that the intent was unmistakable. The cabin fell completely silent. Every eye was on them now. Trina had frozen in the galley, hand over her mouth. Calvin Reed watched with undisguised satisfaction. Slowly, deliberately, Zoe stood up. As she rose to her full height, her jacket fell open, revealing the pilot wings pinned to her chest, the gold emblem of a commercial airline captain with Sterling Airways. The silence in the cabin deepened, punctuated only by a soft gasp from somewhere in the back. Bradley's face transformed from smug authority to dawning horror as his eyes fixed on Zoe's captain wings. He stammered, taking an involuntary step backward. Captain Zoe Washington, she confirmed, her voice carrying through the hushed cabin. Sterling Airways. And yes, I do belong in first class, Mr. Wilson. As a passenger today, but as your colleague every other day. A wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. Phones appeared in hands as passengers began recording the confrontation. Bradley's complexion alternated between ashen and flushed as realization set in. I had no idea, he stammered. There was no indication. That I was a pilot. Zoe finished for him. Or that I belonged in first class. Which assumption are you apologizing for exactly? Trina rushed forward from the galley, panic evident in her expression. Behind her came a tall man in full captain's uniform, his 4 stripes gleaming on dark shoulders. Captain Washington. The man's deep voice carried authority. I thought that was you. Marcus Daniels. He extended his hand. I heard about what you did on Flight 302 yesterday. 157 souls safe because of your quick thinking. The whole airline's talking about it. The revelation rippled through the cabin. A passenger from several rows back leaned forward. Wait, are you the pilot from the news? The emergency landing in Charlotte? Zoe nodded once, maintaining her composure despite the coffee still dripping from her ruined suit. Holy shit, someone whispered from the row behind. Calvin Reed's expression had transformed completely, his earlier smugness replaced by visible discomfort as he suddenly became very interested in his phone screen. Bradley Wilson looked as though he might be sick. Captain Washington, I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Captain Daniels interrupted, his eyebrows rising. What misunderstanding? There was a confusion about seating assignments, Bradley attempted, his voice weak. He accused me of stealing a boarding pass, Zoe stated flatly. After ignoring my service requests for 20 minutes and then physically putting his hands on me while suggesting I didn't belong in this cabin. The chief purser appeared now, a middle-aged woman whose expression suggested she already understood the gravity of the situation. Mr. Wilson, I need you in the galley immediately. Really, this was just a confusion, Bradley tried again. Now, Mr. Wilson. The chief purser's tone left no room for argument. As Bradley retreated to the galley, Captain Daniels turned to Zoe. "Captain Washington, on behalf of the flight crew and Sterling Airways, please accept my deepest apologies. Your reputation precedes you, and this treatment is inexcusable." For a brief moment, Zoe felt a flicker of satisfaction at their reactions, the wide eyes, the dawning horror, the scrambling apologies. But satisfaction quickly curdled into something darker. Why should her accomplishments be necessary to receive basic respect? Why should she need captain's wings to be treated with dignity? "Would you like to join us in the cockpit for a while, Captain?" Daniels offered. "It would be an honor to have you up front." Part of her wanted to accept, to retreat to the familiar sanctuary of the flight deck, away from staring eyes and this public humiliation. But another part, the part that had fought for her place in aviation, knew that walking away now would change nothing. "Thank you, Captain Daniels, but I think I'll stay right here in my assigned seat," she replied, her voice steady. "Though I would appreciate a towel for this coffee stain." Trina immediately produced napkins and club soda, helping Zoe blot at the spreading stain on her suit. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I should have said something earlier." Around them, the buzz of conversation grew as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Several were openly filming now, and Zoe realized with a sinking feeling that this incident would likely find its way online before they even landed. Captain Daniels nodded respectfully. "Of course. Again, my sincere apologies. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." As he returned to the cockpit, Zoe became aware of James Peterson beside her, watching her with something like admiration in his eyes. "Young lady," he said quietly, that was dignity personified. Calvin Reed suddenly rose from his seat, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Captain Washington, is it? Allow me to introduce myself properly. Calvin Reed, Sterling Airways Board of Directors." He extended his hand, a practiced smile replacing his earlier disdain. "Your landing yesterday was exemplary. The company is quite impressed." Zoe regarded his outstretched hand for a long moment before briefly shaking it. "Thank you, Mr. Reed. Though I find it interesting that my professional accomplishments suddenly matter now that you're aware of them." Reed's smile faltered. Well, miscommunications happen. I'm sure Mr. Wilson meant no harm." "I'm sure," Zoe replied evenly, settling back into her seat as a clear dismissal. The chief purser returned, visibly flustered. "Captain Washington, the airline's CEO has been informed of this incident and would like to speak with you upon landing. Mr. Wilson has been reassigned to galley duty for the remainder of the flight." Passengers throughout the cabin were now openly discussing the incident, many turning to look at Zoe with expressions ranging from curiosity to admiration. What had begun as a personal humiliation was rapidly transforming into something much larger, a public relations situation that Sterling Airways would need to address. As Trina returned with fresh coffee, served with obvious deference, Zoe gazed out the window at the clouds below, wondering how what should have been a simple journey to her sister's wedding had become yet another battlefield in her ongoing fight to exist without justification. Have you ever experienced that moment when a seemingly isolated incident suddenly reveals itself as part of a much larger pattern? When the curtain pulls back and you see not just one act of discrimination, but an entire system designed to make certain people feel they don't belong? That's exactly what happened next on Flight 1872. Back in her seat with fresh coffee properly served, Zoe found herself in an unexpected spotlight. The stain on her suit had stopped spreading but remained a visible reminder of the confrontation. She dabbed at it methodically with a damp napkin, focusing on the repetitive motion to center herself as emotions churned beneath her composed exterior. "You know, I marched with King in '63, James Peterson said quietly beside her. His weathered hands rested on the armrests, liver spots marking decades of life experience. "Thought we'd see more progress by now." Zoe glanced at him, reassessing the kindly older gentleman. "Some days it feels like one step forward, 2 steps back." "Progress isn't linear," he nodded. "But what I just witnessed, that took courage." Standing your ground with dignity instead of letting them force you to be either angry or small. That's how change happens. His words triggered a cascade of memories, moments throughout her career when she'd been forced to choose between speaking up and being labeled difficult, or staying silent and letting injustice pass unchallenged. Flight School, 2008, the instructor who'd referred to her as diversity enrollment within earshot. The evaluator who'd made her demonstrate emergency procedures 3 times while passing her white male colleagues on the first try. Her first airline, 2012, being mistaken for a flight attendant so frequently that she'd started wearing her pilot's uniform to crew briefings despite company policy allowing casual dress. Sterling Airways, 2018, the passenger who demanded a different pilot after seeing her during boarding. The chief pilot who'd suggested she might be more comfortable flying less prestigious routes. Yesterday's emergency landing, the first officer who'd afterward suggested to reporters that he'd talked her through it, despite flight recorder evidence showing her clear command of the situation from start to finish. A light touch on her arm pulled her from her thoughts. Trina stood beside her, offering a bottle of sparkling water. "Captain Washington," she said, her voice low. "I want to apologize properly. I saw how Bradley was treating you, and I didn't step in." "You're not responsible for his actions," Zoe replied. Trina glanced toward the galley, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "This isn't the first time. Bradley has a pattern with certain passengers. I've reported it twice to management, but nothing ever happens." Her fingers twisted nervously around a water bottle. "Many of us have experienced similar treatment within the company. It just gets buried." The revelation wasn't particularly surprising, but it added another dimension to the incident. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's prejudice, it was about a corporate culture that enabled it. From across the aisle, a passenger leaned over. "Excuse me, but aren't you the pilot from that emergency landing yesterday? With the hydraulic failure?" Zoe nodded, resignation settling over her as she realized privacy was no longer an option. "My cousin was on that flight," the woman continued, eyes wide. "He said it was the smoothest emergency landing he'd ever experienced, and he's a frequent flyer. You saved his life." The story began circulating through the cabin, passengers turning to look at her with new understanding. The narrative was shifting from "black woman confronted in first class" to "hero pilot disrespected by airline staff." While perhaps more favorable, it still missed the point: she shouldn't need to be extraordinary to be treated with basic dignity. 40 minutes later, Bradley reappeared in the cabin, now overcompensating with excessive politeness. "Captain Washington, can I get you anything at all? Another coffee? A snack? Perhaps a different seat away from the window?" His transparent attempt at damage control felt almost worse than the initial disrespect. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied coolly. During a bathroom break, Trina pulled her aside near the galley. "The CEO called the cockpit directly," she whispered. "The whole executive team is waiting at SFO. They're in full crisis mode." "Great," Zoe sighed. All she'd wanted was to reach her sister's wedding without incident. "There's more," Trina continued. "I checked with other crew members. Bradley has had 7 complaints filed against him for similar behavior toward passengers of color. All mysteriously resolved with no disciplinary action." She hesitated. "And Mr. Reed in 1A? He chairs the personnel committee on the board. The same committee that reviews discrimination complaints." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just an incident, it was a glimpse into systemic issues within Sterling Airways, the very company that had celebrated her as a hero just yesterday. Returning to her seat, Zoe found her phone filling with notifications. The incident had already hit social media, with passengers' videos circulating rapidly. Hashtag Captain Zoe and hashtag Sterling Airways racism were trending. What had begun as personal humiliation was exploding into a public relations nightmare for the airline. "Quite a situation developing," James Peterson observed as she settled back beside him. "Not what I planned for my day off," Zoe admitted. Sometimes the battles choose us, he replied. Question is, what will you do with this moment? The question hung between them as the plane continued its journey westward. Zoe had spent her career navigating discrimination with calculated restraint, knowing that being labeled difficult could end her hard-won position. But today, circumstances had handed her unexpected leverage. For perhaps the first time, she held genuine power to demand accountability. What would you do in Zoe's position? Would you accept the airline's inevitably generous offer to sweep things under the rug? Or would you use this moment to push for real change? Comment 1 if you think she should fight for systemic change, even at personal cost. Hit that like button if you've ever had to choose between speaking up or keeping the peace in the face of injustice. And while you're thinking about that, let me ask you this: what happens when the power dynamic suddenly shifts, and those who were comfortable in their prejudice find themselves exposed? Subscribe to find out as our story continues. The plane reached cruising altitude, the soft hum of engines creating white noise that normally lulled passengers to sleep. But sleep was the furthest thing from anyone's mind in the first-class cabin of Flight 1872. An invisible current of tension ran through the air, charging every interaction with heightened significance. Zoe's phone vibrated with an incoming message. A text from her sister Kendra: "Your flight okay?" Seeing something on Twitter about Sterling Airways and a black female pilot? News traveled faster than jets these days. She typed back quickly, "I'm fine. We'll explain when I land." Still making rehearsal dinner. The intercom chimed softly. "Captain Washington," came Captain Daniel's voice. "If you have a moment, could you please come to the flight deck? We have a call for you." Curious glances followed her as she made her way forward. The cockpit door opened before she could knock, Captain Daniels ushering her inside with a grimace that spoke volumes. "CEO on secure line," he explained, handing her a headset. "Richard Blackwell himself." Zoe raised an eyebrow but accepted the headset, settling into the jump seat. "This is Captain Washington." "Captain." The voice exuded practiced charm and barely concealed panic. "Richard Blackwell here. First, let me personally apologize for the unfortunate incident aboard your flight today. Completely unacceptable. Not what Sterling Airways stands for at all." "I appreciate that," Zoe replied neutrally. "I'm calling to assure you we're taking this extremely seriously. Mr. Wilson has been suspended pending investigation, and I'd like to offer you our platinum compensation package, upgrade vouchers, bonus miles, the works." Zoe watched the clouds pass below, considering her response. "Mr. Blackwell, while I appreciate the offer, I don't think upgrade vouchers address the underlying issue here." A brief pause. Of course. What did you have in mind?" "I'd prefer to discuss that in person." "I understand you'll be meeting us at the gate." Another pause, longer this time. "Yes, I'll be there personally. We're eager to resolve this to your satisfaction." After finishing the call, Zoe returned to her seat, aware of eyes tracking her movement through the cabin. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. Where before she'd been invisible, now she was hypervisible. Where she'd been deemed unworthy of basic service, now she held the airline's reputation in her hands. She'd barely settled back into 2A when Calvin Reed appeared beside her, his earlier condescension replaced with an ingratiating smile. "Captain Washington, might I have a word?" he asked, gesturing to the empty seat across the aisle. Zoe nodded once, her face carefully neutral. Reed sat, leaning forward with practiced intimacy. "I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. As a board member, I can assure you Sterling Airways values diversity tremendously. In fact, we just approved a new initiative last quarter specifically focused on recruiting female pilots of color." "How many have you hired?" Zoe asked. Reed blinked. "I don't have the exact figures." 3, Zoe supplied. "Out of 78 new hires. I serve on the pilot recruitment committee." Reed cleared his throat. Well, these things take time. The important thing is we're making progress. His voice lowered. Between us, I think we can resolve this situation amicably. Your emergency landing yesterday was exemplary, you're valuable to Sterling Airways. We wouldn't want this unfortunate incident to damage the relationship. The threat, thinly veiled beneath corporate pleasantries, hung in the air between them. Are you suggesting my career might suffer if I pursue this matter? Zoe asked, her voice level. Reed's smile tightened. Not at all. I'm simply saying we all benefit from discretion. The airline's reputation, your reputation, we're all on the same team. Interesting perspective, Zoe replied. I wasn't aware teammates treated each other the way Mr. Wilson treated me today. Reed's phone chimed. He glanced down, his expression shifting as he read the message. Excuse me, he muttered, rising abruptly and returning to his seat where he immediately began making calls in a hushed, urgent tone. Trina appeared at Zoe's side. Captain Washington, I have something you should see. She discreetly handed over a tablet. It's Bradley Wilson's personnel file. I asked a friend in HR to pull it. Should you be showing me this? Zoe asked, surprised. Probably not, Trina admitted. But you should know what you're dealing with. The file detailed a history of similar incidents, complaints filed by passengers of color and female colleagues, all mysteriously resolved without disciplinary action. Each complaint investigation had been overseen by the Personnel Committee, chaired by Calvin Reed. There's more, Trina continued, her voice barely above a whisper. After you went to the cockpit, Mr. Reed was on his phone with someone in HR, asking them to pull your file and look for any performance issues or complaints they could leverage. Zoe's expression remained impassive, but anger flared inside her. So that was their game, find something, anything to discredit her if she didn't quietly accept their token apology. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. Some of us have been documenting these incidents for years, Trina replied. Nothing ever changes. But maybe with someone like you, someone they can't ignore, maybe this time will be different. The weight of responsibility settled on Zoe's shoulders. This was no longer just about her experience. She had become an unexpected catalyst, thrust into a position to potentially force change within a system designed to resist it. Captain Daniels reappeared, his expression grave. We've received an unusual request from headquarters. They're asking that upon landing, you exit through the rear door where a private car will be waiting. To protect your privacy, they said. Zoe understood immediately. They wanted to separate her from the media already gathering at SFO, to control the narrative. I appreciate their concern, she replied evenly, but I'll be exiting through the main door with the other first-class passengers, as normal. Daniels nodded, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. I'll relay that message. As he walked away, James Peterson chuckled softly beside her. They're scared, he observed. And they should be. I haven't seen a company this frantic since the Montgomery bus boycott hit National City Line's bottom line. I'm just one person, Zoe pointed out. So was Rosa Parks, Peterson replied. But she wasn't alone, and neither are you. He pulled out a business card, handing it to her. James Peterson, Sterling Airways shareholder since 1986. And as it happens, I serve on several corporate boards focused on equity initiatives. If you decide to push for real change, you'll have allies. The realization dawned gradually. This single incident on a routine flight had unwittingly connected her to a network of people who had been waiting for precisely this moment, this catalyst, to challenge entrenched practices. Her phone buzzed again. A text from her father, seeing news about incident on flight. You okay? Mom worried. Another from Kendra, holy shit sis, you're trending. Tell me you're not backing down. And finally, a notification from Sterling Airways Employee Forum where dozens of messages of support were pouring in from colleagues, many sharing their own experiences of discrimination within the company. As the plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, Zoe gazed out at the golden California sunshine breaking through the clouds. This trip to her sister's wedding had unexpectedly transformed into something far more consequential, a potential turning point not just for her, but for countless others who had suffered in silence. The question was no longer whether she would speak up, but how loudly, and for whom. The descent into San Francisco International Airport felt surreal. Through the window, Zoe could see the iconic Golden Gate Bridge in the distance, partially shrouded in morning fog. Under normal circumstances, the sight would have filled her with anticipation for her sister's wedding. Now, it only heightened her awareness of the confrontation waiting on the ground. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into San Francisco," Captain Daniels announced over the intercom. Local time is 10:42 a.m. with clear skies and temperature at 68 degrees. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Trina moved through the cabin, collecting final service items. When she reached Zoe, she leaned in close. "Just got word from ground staff. There are reporters at the gate. At least 3 local stations and someone from CNN." Zoe nodded, unsurprised. The videos had gone viral during their 5-hour flight, amplified by the ongoing national conversation about racial bias. What might have been dismissed as an isolated incident in another era was now being recognized as part of a pattern demanding accountability. Also, Trina added, even quieter, 5 Sterling Airways executives are waiting in the terminal, including Chief of Operations Patricia Westfield. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, taxiing toward Terminal 3. Through the cabin windows, Zoe could see the unmistakable gathering of news cameras positioned strategically near the jet bridge. Her phone chimed with a message from Kendra, "At airport with Daddy. Terminal 3 baggage claim. Media everywhere. You okay?" Calvin Reed had spent the last hour of the flight in intense phone conversations, his initial smugness replaced by visible anxiety. Now, as the plane approached the gate, he made one final attempt to control the situation. "Captain Washington," he said, appearing beside her seat as passengers prepared to deplane. "A word before we land? In private?" "Whatever you need to say, Mr. Reed, you can say right here," Zoe replied calmly. Reed's jaw tightened. "I've been authorized to offer you a significant compensation package in recognition of your inconvenience today. 6 figures, plus a guaranteed promotion to the international fleet." The naked attempt at buying her silence was almost insulting in its transparency. "And in exchange? A simple NDA. Standard procedure for resolving customer service matters." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Plus, we'd appreciate your discretion with the media. A brief statement that the matter has been resolved satisfactorily." Zoe considered him for a long moment. "Mr. Reed, do you know why I became a pilot?" The question clearly caught him off guard. "I'm sorry. My father worked 40 years for Piedmont Airlines, then U.S. Airways. Baggage handler. Never missed a day. Never got promoted above supervisor despite applying for management positions dozens of times." She held Reed's gaze steadily. "When I was 8, he took me to the airport, pointed at a plane taking off and said, 'Zoe Bird, they might keep me on the ground, but nothing's gonna stop you from flying.'" Reed shifted uncomfortably. "A touching story, but..." "I'm not finished," Zoe continued, her voice quiet but firm. "I didn't become a pilot just for myself. I did it for every black girl who's told the sky isn't for her. For every qualified candidate passed over because they don't fit the culture. Your money doesn't interest me, Mr. Reed. Change does." The seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers began standing, retrieving bags from overhead compartments. "You're making a mistake," Reed warned, his veneer of civility cracking. "This could have been a win-win." "I disagree," Zoe replied, standing to collect her carry-on. "But I appreciate you making the company's priorities so clear." As first-class passengers began deplaning, Captain Daniels appeared at the cockpit door, catching Zoe's eye with a subtle nod of respect. The moment she stepped into the jet bridge, Zoe could feel the shift in atmosphere. Airport staff who normally blended into the background watched with undisguised interest. At the gate, a phalanx of suits waited tensely, Sterling Airways executives easily identifiable by their navy blazers and anxious expressions. Captain Washington, a polished woman in her 50s, stepped forward, hand extended. Patricia Westfield, Chief Operations Officer. On behalf of Sterling Airways, I want to personally. Ms. Westfield, Zoe interrupted politely, I appreciate you coming, but I'd like to meet my family first. They're waiting. Of course, Westfield nodded quickly. We've arranged a private room where we can all speak comfortably. Away from. She gestured vaguely toward the terminal where media cameras were clearly visible. That won't be necessary, Zoe replied. If Sterling Airways has a statement to make, I'm happy to hear it right here. A flash of panic crossed Westfield's face as she realized Zoe would not be quietly sequestered. Perhaps we could. Zoe. The familiar voice cut through the terminal noise. Kendra Washington, resplendent in a bright yellow dress that complemented her dark skin, pushed past a security officer with the determination of a sister on a mission. Behind her came their father, Harold Washington, still straight-backed and dignified at 73. Baby girl, Harold engulfed her in a hug that smelled of the same Old Spice he'd worn her entire life. You all right? I'm fine, Daddy, Zoe assured him, fighting unexpected tears. She hadn't realized how much she needed her family's presence until this moment. Don't look fine to me, he observed, noting the coffee stain on her suit. Looks like somebody put hands on my daughter. Kendra embraced her next, whispering fiercely in her ear, the whole family's watching this live stream. Mama's got the church prayer circle activated. You better not let these people off easy. As Zoe turned back to address Westfield, she noticed Trina exiting the jet bridge, followed by James Peterson and, surprisingly, Captain Daniels. Behind them came other passengers from the flight, many with phones raised, recording. Ms. Washington, a different executive stepped forward. William Thornton, Sterling Airways legal counsel. We've prepared a statement addressing today's unfortunate incident, along with a comprehensive compensation package. Mr. Thornton, Zoe interrupted, before we discuss compensation, I'd like to know why Bradley Wilson is still employed by Sterling Airways after 7 formal complaints of discriminatory behavior. Thornton froze, his practiced expression faltering. I'm not sure where you got that information, but personnel matters are confidential. And I'd like to understand, Zoe continued, why Calvin Reed, who oversees the personnel committee that buries these complaints, felt comfortable making racially charged comments to me during today's flight. A reporter had edged close enough to capture this exchange. Thornton noticed and plastered on a professional smile. These are serious allegations that we'll need to investigate thoroughly. Sterling Airways has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Zero tolerance? Trina stepped forward unexpectedly. Is that why my formal complaint about Mr. Wilson's behavior toward a Nigerian family in business class last month was dismissed without investigation? Or why cabin manager Darius Jackson was passed over for promotion 6 times despite perfect performance reviews? Other employees in the terminal began moving closer, drawn by the confrontation. Zoe recognized several pilots and flight attendants of color among them, watching with guarded hope. Ms. Martinez, this isn't the appropriate forum, Westfield began. When is the appropriate forum? Another flight attendant called out. Because HR sure isn't listening. The situation was spiraling beyond the executive's control. What had begun as damage control for a single incident was exposing years of systemic issues. Captain Washington, Westfield tried again, desperation edging into her voice, we value your service to Sterling Airways enormously. We'd like to offer you the position of Chief Diversity Officer, effective immediately. Full executive compensation, board meetings, the works. The naked attempt to co-opt her protest into a PR win stunned Zoe momentarily. A prestigious title and substantial salary in exchange for her silence, packaged as progress. Creating another position won't solve your problem, Zoe replied, aware that every word was likely being recorded. You don't need a diversity officer. You need accountability. Harold Washington stepped closer to his daughter, his presence solid and supporting. Seems to me, he said, his deep voice carrying, that Sterling Airways has a choice to make. Real change, or just damage control. As if on cue, Calvin Reed emerged from the jet bridge, stopping short when he saw the gathered crowd and media. His eyes locked with Zoe's across the terminal, a mixture of threat and plea in his expression. Captain Washington, a reporter called out, can you tell us what happened on today's flight? Zoe looked from the reporter to the Sterling executives, to her family, to the employees watching with hope and fear intermingled on their faces. The truth was, Sterling Airways didn't have a choice to make. She did. The Sterling Airways conference room on the top floor of their San Francisco operations building offered a panoramic view of runways and taxiways. Planes took off and landed in perfect choreography, a testament to the precision and professionalism that kept commercial aviation safe. If only the human systems were managed with the same care and attention. 24 hours after Flight 1872 landed, Zoe sat at the head of a table that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. To her right sat her father, Harold, whose pride was evident despite his attempt at a poker face. To her left was James Peterson, who had revealed himself to be not just a sympathetic bystander but a strategic ally with significant Sterling Airways stock holdings. Across from them sat a very different group, Patricia Westfield, the increasingly uncomfortable COO, William Thornton from legal, Abigail Chen, head of HR, and conspicuously absent, Calvin Reed, whose emergency, family matter, had conveniently arisen overnight. Let's continue, Zoe said, turning a page in the document before her. Employee demographic data shows that while Sterling Airways has hired 47 pilots of color in the past 5 years, 39 have left the company within 18 months. Can you explain this retention issue? The executives exchanged glances. Abigail Chen finally spoke. The airline industry is highly competitive. Pilots receive offers from multiple carriers. Interesting, Zoe replied. Because I have statements from 23 of those pilots citing a hostile work environment as their primary reason for leaving. She slid a folder across the table. Inside were testimonials gathered overnight through an impromptu network that had formed after her confrontation went viral. Current and former employees had flooded her with messages, evidence, and suppressed complaints, years of documentation finally finding an outlet. Where did you get these? Thornton demanded, flipping through pages with growing alarm. These are confidential personnel matters. They were shared voluntarily by the individuals involved, James Peterson interjected smoothly. Who, I might add, have waived confidentiality to speak with the independent investigator I've engaged on behalf of concerned shareholders. The mention of shareholders and independent investigators visibly rattled the executives. What had begun as a customer service issue had escalated into a governance concern that could affect stock prices and board positions. We had no idea these issues were so widespread, Westfield claimed, her voice strained with forced sincerity. Harold Washington snorted softly but said nothing, his expression conveying decades of hearing similar denials. Zoe maintained her composure. Let's discuss Bradley Wilson's personnel file. According to records, he's had 7 formal complaints for discriminatory behavior, yet received a promotion last quarter. How does that align with Sterling's stated zero-tolerance policy? Without Mr. Reed present to address personnel committee decisions, Thornton began. Mr. Reed's absence is convenient but not disruptive to our discussion, Zoe interrupted. The documentation speaks for itself. The meeting continued for 3 hours, methodically working through evidence of systemic discrimination that had been hiding in plain sight within Sterling Airways culture. By the time they adjourned, the executives' earlier defensiveness had given way to grim acceptance of the undeniable reality before them. Outside the conference room, a different kind of meeting was taking place. In the employee break room, Trina Martinez had organized an unprecedented gathering. Flight attendants, baggage handlers, gate agents, and pilots, predominantly people of color, filled the space beyond capacity, spilling into hallways. For years, we've been told our experiences were isolated incidents, Trina addressed the crowd. That we were too sensitive, or not understanding airline culture. Yesterday proved what we've always known, the problem is systemic. A maintenance technician raised his hand. I've filed 3 complaints about my supervisor's comments. HR always says there's insufficient evidence. What's different now? Visibility, Trina replied simply. Captain Washington's confrontation has over 12 million views online. Sterling can't bury this one. When Zoe entered the break room after her meeting, the crowd fell silent momentarily before erupting in applause. The weight of their expectations pressed on her shoulders, they were looking to her not just as a symbol but as a leader who could translate this moment into lasting change. I don't have all the answers, she told them honestly. But I do know this, change doesn't come from one person standing alone. It comes from many people standing together. While Zoe navigated corporate politics at Sterling headquarters, across town at the Grand Hyatt, her sister Kendra was facing a different crisis. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for that evening, with the wedding just 2 days away. You can't be serious, Kendra exclaimed when Zoe finally returned to the hotel. They're trying to buy you off with a fancy title. Chief Diversity Officer, Zoe confirmed, sinking onto the bed and finally kicking off her shoes. The coffee-stained suit had been replaced with a hotel gift shop outfit that was functional but far from wedding appropriate. Full executive compensation, board meetings, the works. And you told them to shove it, right? Kendra demanded, pacing the room in her wedding planning binder. It's not that simple, Zoe sighed. A seat at the table means influence, the ability to affect policy from the inside. It means they control you, Kendra countered. Turn you into their token success story while nothing actually changes. Their father knocked once before entering with a tray of room service coffee. Your mother's on her way up, he warned, setting the tray down. And she's got opinions. When doesn't she? Both sisters replied in unison, then looked at each other and laughed, a moment of normalcy in the chaos their lives had become. Harold's phone buzzed. He checked it, eyebrows rising. Well. Seems like your friend Mr. Reed isn't just dealing with a family emergency. According to this news alert, an internal whistleblower has provided evidence that he personally intervened to suppress discrimination complaints at Sterling. Stocks down 4% already. Before Zoe could respond, there was another knock. But instead of her mother, it was James Peterson, looking unusually agitated. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but Sterling's PR team just released a statement announcing your appointment as Chief Diversity Officer, without your acceptance. They're trying to control the narrative. Kendra's expression darkened. See? What did I tell you? Zoe's phone began buzzing incessantly, colleagues, media, and Sterling executives all demanding her response to an announcement she hadn't approved. That's not all, Peterson continued. They've scheduled a press conference for tomorrow morning. They expect you to stand beside Westfield and Thornton, presenting a united front. During my sister's wedding rehearsal, Zoe noted bitterly. Harold Washington had been quiet, watching his daughters with the weathered patience of a man who had seen corporate America's playbook many times before. Now he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of experience. When I was pushing for that supervisor position at U.S. Airways, they kept telling me to be patient, that change takes time. 30 years I gave that company, and in the end, nothing changed because those in power had no reason to change it. He looked directly at Zoe. They're offering you a title, not power. Real power is what they're afraid you'll use if you don't take their offer. As if to underscore his point, Zoe's phone lit up with a text from Trina, emergency meeting called by COO. They're trying to identify instigators who shared personnel files. 3 people already suspended. The battle lines were being drawn more clearly by the hour. Sterling Airways was mobilizing its considerable resources to contain the situation, to isolate Zoe from potential allies and neutralize her influence through the classic strategy of elevating her just enough to separate her from the movement she had inadvertently sparked. The board meeting is Saturday morning, Peterson noted. The same time as your sister's wedding. The timing wasn't coincidental. They were forcing her to choose between her family and her cause, betting that family would win and the momentum would dissipate without her presence. Kendra, who had been furiously texting, suddenly looked up with fierce determination. What if we moved the ceremony? Not the reception, that's too many moving parts, but just the actual wedding. Friday morning instead of Saturday. Would that work? Kendra, no, Zoe protested. This is your day. You've been planning it for a year. And I'll be damned if I let Sterling Airways ruin it, Kendra replied firmly. Besides, what's more important, some arbitrary date, or making sure my badass sister can fight corporate racism and see me get married? Harold grinned proudly at both his daughters. Your mother's going to have opinions about this too. Mom will understand, Kendra insisted. Especially when I tell her it's so you can channel Grandma Esther. Their grandmother Esther had been a civil rights activist in the 1960s, arrested 3 times for organizing protests in Birmingham. She had passed away when the sisters were teenagers, but her legacy of courage had shaped their family's values. As the weight of decisions pressed upon her, Zoe felt an unexpected clarity emerging from the chaos. Sterling Airways had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed she was fighting for herself, for recognition, compensation, or career advancement. But this had never been about just her. It was about every employee who had been silenced, every passenger who had been profiled, every qualified candidate passed over. And in trying to separate her from her family, they had unwittingly strengthened her most important support system. All right, she said finally. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Not just band-aids and promises, but structural change. Peterson nodded approvingly. I'll contact the other concerned shareholders tonight. We'll have a voting block ready for Saturday. Harold clapped his hands once, decisively. And I'll help your mother understand why her daughter's wedding is moving up a day. God help us all. As the impromptu strategy session continued in the hotel room, Zoe's phone buzzed with another message, this one from Captain Marcus Daniels, Pilots Union emergency meeting tonight. We've got your back. For the first time since Bradley Wilson's hand had connected with her shoulder on Flight 1872, Zoe felt the tide truly turning. Not because of viral videos or media attention, but because people throughout the Sterling Airways ecosystem were finally finding the courage to stand together and say, enough. Dawn broke over San Francisco Bay with golden light that belied the tension of the day ahead. In the bridal suite of the Grand Hyatt, Kendra Washington stood in her wedding gown, an elegant sheath of ivory satin that complemented her deep brown skin perfectly. Behind her, their mother Gloria adjusted the veil with hands that had raised 2 daughters to never back down from a fight. You're sure about this? Gloria asked, meeting Kendra's eyes in the mirror. Moving your entire wedding day to accommodate your sister's corporate showdown? Kendra's reflection smiled confidently. Mom, when have I ever done anything I wasn't sure about? Gloria laughed softly. Fair point. She pinned the last section of veil in place. Your grandmother would be proud of both of you today. 2 floors below, in a hastily converted conference room, Zoe sat in a navy pantsuit, reviewing documents with James Peterson and a team of allies they'd assembled over the past 36 hours, 3 Sterling Airways board members sympathetic to their cause, union representatives from pilots, flight attendants, and ground crew, 2 civil rights attorneys, and Trina Martinez, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for employees speaking out. Bradley Wilson's case is the simplest, one attorney explained. 7 documented complaints, all buried by the Personnel Committee. Clear pattern of discrimination. The systemic issues will be harder to address, Peterson cautioned. Corporate culture doesn't change overnight. Zoe checked her watch, 6:45 a.m. In just over an hour, she'd watch her sister exchange vows in a ceremony moved specifically so Zoe could attend the critical 10 a.m. board meeting that would determine Sterling Airways' response to the growing crisis. Her phone buzzed with a news alert: Sterling Airways stock down 8% amid discrimination allegations. CEO calls emergency board meeting. Another message followed immediately, from William Thornton, Sterling's legal counsel: final offer, Chief Diversity Officer, $350,000 annual salary, seat on Executive Committee. Press conference 9 a.m. to announce. Need confirmation by 7:30. They were still trying to buy her off, still hoping to present a united front before the board meeting. Still misunderstanding what this fight was actually about. They're panicking, Peterson observed, reading over her shoulder. Which means they're vulnerable. The hotel room phone rang. Gloria Washington's voice came through the speaker: Zoe, baby, your sister wants you upstairs for some pre-wedding photos. And that nice Captain Daniels is here with some of your colleagues. Zoe hadn't expected Marcus to actually attend. She'd invited her fellow pilots more as a gesture of solidarity than with any expectation they'd show up for a wedding that had been rescheduled on 24 hours' notice. Tell them I'll be right up, she replied, gathering her notes. To the room, she said, I need 30 minutes. Then we finalize our strategy. When the elevator doors opened on the bridal suite floor, Zoe was stunned to find not just Captain Daniels, but over a dozen Sterling Airways pilots in full uniform lining the hallway. As she approached, they formed an honor guard, standing at attention. Captain Washington, Daniels said formally. The pilots of Sterling Airways wanted to show our support, both for your sister's wedding and for the stand you're taking today. Emotion tightened Zoe's throat. These were her colleagues, many of whom she knew only in passing. Their presence, and the risk they were taking by so publicly aligning themselves with her cause, spoke volumes. Thank you, she managed, shaking Daniel's hand. This means more than I can say. Inside the suite, Kendra squealed with delight at the unexpected honor guard. Now that's what I call a wedding upgrade. Do they do this for all pilot sisters, or am I special? You're definitely special, Zoe laughed, embracing her sister carefully to avoid wrinkling the gown. You look incredible. Save the compliments for after I've pulled off a wedding ceremony with 24 hours notice, Kendra replied, though she beamed with pride. Mom's still mad about the flowers, but Dad talked the florist into an emergency delivery. Their father entered, resplendent in a charcoal tuxedo that set off his silver hair. Baby girl, he said, kissing Zoe's cheek. Your reinforcements have arrived. He gestured toward the window. Outside in the hotel's garden where the ceremony would take place, Zoe could see dozens of Sterling Airways employees in uniform, flight attendants, ground crew, maintenance workers, quietly taking seats among the wedding guests. Trina had coordinated this show of support, turning a private family celebration into a powerful statement of solidarity. Is this okay? Zoe asked Kendra uncertainly. It's your wedding day. Kendra squeezed her hand. It's perfect. Besides, Jackson's family didn't fill half their allotted seats anyway. Her fiancé's relatives had been less than enthusiastic about his marriage to a black woman, another battle the Washington family had faced with dignity. A hotel staff member appeared at the door. Ms. Washington. We're ready to begin in 15 minutes. As the family made final preparations, Zoe's phone buzzed again. Calvin Reed, board members arriving early. Westfield organizing opposition. Need you at meeting ASAP. Then another message, from Patricia Westfield herself, press conference proceeding at 9 a.m. with or without you. Final chance to join the company's solution. The attempts at manipulation were growing more desperate by the minute. Zoe silenced her phone and slipped it into her pocket. For the next hour, she would be fully present for her sister. Sterling Airways could wait. The ceremony was brief but beautiful. Beneath a trellis draped with white roses and ivy, Kendra and Jackson exchanged vows that spoke of overcoming obstacles and standing together against adversity, words that carried extra weight given the circumstances. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause from the Sterling Airways employees was especially thunderous. As guests moved toward the reception area for a quick champagne toast before the formal evening celebration, Zoe found herself surrounded by colleagues she'd never met in person, baggage handlers from Oakland, flight attendants from Seattle, mechanics from Denver. All sharing stories of discrimination they'd experienced or witnessed. "You're giving us a voice," one older gate agent told her, eyes brimming with tears. "For 30 years, I've kept my head down, afraid to speak up. Not anymore." At 9:15 a.m., as wedding guests mingled with unexpected airline allies, James Peterson approached with his phone displaying a live stream. On screen, Patricia Westfield stood at a podium, flanked by William Thornton and a visibly uncomfortable CEO Richard Blackwell. "Sterling Airways is committed to diversity and inclusion at every level," Westfield was saying. "Today, we are announcing a comprehensive initiative to address concerns raised by recent events." "They're doing it without you," Peterson said quietly. Announcing their own diversity program to get ahead of the board meeting. Zoe watched as Westfield detailed a series of superficial changes: unconscious bias training, a diversity hiring goal, a commitment to review practices. Nothing structural. Nothing with accountability. Nothing that would prevent another Bradley Wilson situation. "Where is Captain Washington?" a reporter's voice came through the stream. "Will she be leading this initiative?" Westfield's smile tightened. "Captain Washington has been offered a leadership role in our diversity efforts. We're awaiting her response." The camera panned to show the assembled media, and Zoe was surprised to recognize several Sterling employees standing among the reporters, wearing their uniforms and expressions of open skepticism. "Is it true that Bradley Wilson had 7 prior complaints for similar behavior?" called out one bold flight attendant. The press conference was going off script. On screen, CEO Blackwell leaned over to whisper urgently to Westfield, who nodded and quickly wrapped up. "We'll take additional questions after today's board meeting. Thank you." As the live stream ended, Kendra appeared at Zoe's side, still in her wedding gown but now with a look of fierce determination that matched her S. 6 months later, Zoe Washington stood in the cockpit of Sterling Airways Flight 302, running through her pre-flight checklist with practiced efficiency. Through the windshield, the Atlanta skyline glittered in the early morning light. The same flight number, the same route that had made her a hero a year earlier after her emergency landing. "Captain Washington." The voice belonged to her first officer, Malik Johnson, a recent hire who represented the changing face of Sterling Airways. "Passenger manifest complete. Full flight today." "Thank you, First Officer Johnson," she replied with a smile. "Weather report? Clear skies all the way to Charlotte. Might hit some turbulence over the Appalachians, but nothing significant." Zoe nodded, completing her instrument checks. So much had changed in 6 months, yet the fundamentals of flying remained constant: the checklist, the procedures, the protocols that kept passengers safe. If only human systems had always been designed with such care. The transformation at Sterling Airways had been neither quick nor easy. The initial euphoria of the board meeting victory had given way to the hard, unglamorous work of institutional change. Calvin Reed had indeed resigned, along with 3 other executives who had enabled the discriminatory culture. Bradley Wilson had been terminated after an independent review confirmed the pattern of behavior documented in the complaints. But the real change went deeper than personnel. Sterling Airways had implemented a transparent complaint system with meaningful accountability. Hiring and promotion practices were restructured to eliminate bias. Training programs were overhauled to address not just overt discrimination but the subtle microaggressions that had poisoned the company culture. Most significantly, Sterling had established an employee advocacy committee with real power, the ability to review policy changes, access complaint data, and report directly to the board. Trina Martinez, promoted to Senior Cabin Services Manager, chaired the committee. "Captain Washington." The chief purser appeared at the cockpit door. "Boarding complete. We're ready when you are." "Thank you, Ms. Davis. We'll begin pushback in approximately 5 minutes." As the purser returned to the cabin, Zoe's phone chimed with a final message before she would switch it to flight mode. "From Kendra, happy anniversary, sis. 1 year since you flipped a coffee stain into a revolution. Jackson says hi. Mom wants to know when you're coming for dinner. Love you." Zoe smiled, typing a quick reply before powering down her phone. Her relationship with her family had deepened through the crisis, old tensions dissolved by standing together when it mattered most. After completing her final checks, Zoe activated the cabin intercom. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Captain Zoe Washington. On behalf of First Officer Johnson and our entire crew, welcome aboard Sterling Airways Flight 302 to Charlotte." As she delivered the standard greeting, she caught sight of her reflection in the cockpit window, captain stripes on her shoulders, confidence in her posture, purpose in her expression. Not just a pilot, but a catalyst for change. The past 6 months hadn't been without challenges. There had been resistance from those invested in the old ways, attempts to water down reforms, moments when momentum seemed to stall. But with each setback came renewed determination from the coalition that had formed around her. James Peterson had leveraged his influence as a shareholder to keep pressure on the board. Captain Daniels had ensured the pilots' union remained actively engaged in the transformation process. Her father had even come out of retirement to serve as a consultant on Sterling's new employee relations team, bringing decades of experience from the ground level of airline operations. Most remarkably, Bradley Wilson had reached out 3 months after his termination with a handwritten letter. Not an excuse or justification, but a genuine acknowledgement of his prejudice and the harm it had caused. He'd enrolled in an anti-racism program, was working with a community organization in Atlanta's predominantly black neighborhoods, and thanked her for forcing him to confront biases he'd denied for decades. As Flight 302 pushed back from the gate, Zoe observed a new flight attendant demonstrating the safety procedures, a young black woman who might have faced the same barriers Zoe had encountered a decade earlier, but who now had systems in place to protect her from the worst of them. The plane taxied toward the runway, engines rumbling with contained power. Zoe felt that familiar surge of satisfaction that came with commanding such a complex machine, with bearing the responsibility for hundreds of lives. But now there was something else too, pride in knowing that her presence in the cockpit meant something beyond her individual achievement. She had become both a symbol and a catalyst for something larger than herself. "Sterling 302, cleared for takeoff," came the controller's voice through her headset. "Roger, cleared for takeoff," Zoe replied, advancing the throttles smoothly. The aircraft gathered speed, racing down the runway until the gentle pressure on the yoke lifted them into the sky. As Atlanta fell away beneath them, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her here, not just her career path from aspiring pilot to captain, but the unexpected detour through confrontation and transformation. The incident on Flight 1872 had begun with humiliation, coffee spilled across her suit, prejudice displayed for all to see. It could have ended there, with a personal apology and compensation package, with her silence purchased through promotion. Instead, it had become a pivotal moment not just for her, but for hundreds of employees and thousands of passengers who would never know her name but whose experiences would be forever changed by the systems now in place. 6 months after that fateful flight, Sterling Airways had become an industry leader in inclusive practices. Other airlines were studying their reformed complaint procedures and transparent reporting systems. The Employee Advocacy Committee had become a model for corporate accountability. Zoe herself had turned down multiple offers for executive positions, choosing instead to remain in the cockpit while serving as a mentor to young pilots of color through a program she'd helped establish. The cockpit was where she belonged, where she'd always belonged, despite those who had tried to convince her otherwise. As Flight 302 leveled off at cruising altitude, First Officer Johnson adjusted his heading slightly. "Captain Washington," he said, his voice carrying the deference of a junior officer but none of the uncertainty that might have colored such interactions in the past. "May I ask you something personal?" Of course, First Officer. That day on Flight 1872, did you know what would happen? Did you realize it would change everything? Zoe considered the question carefully. No, she answered honestly. I just knew I couldn't let it pass. Not again. Not anymore. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. My sister's applying to flight school next year. Because of you. Because she saw what happened and thought, if Captain Washington can stand her ground, so can I. Zoe smiled, the simple statement affecting her more deeply than any corporate award or media recognition had. Tell her the sky's waiting for her. The intercom chimed, and the chief purser's voice came through. Captain Washington. We have a passenger in first class, seat 2A. A Mr. James Peterson. He's asking if you might have a moment to say hello when it's convenient. Please tell Mr. Peterson I'll stop by after we reach cruising altitude, Zoe replied. The coincidence, or perhaps intentional symmetry, of Peterson occupying seat 2A, the very seat where this journey had begun, wasn't lost on her. The elderly gentleman had become both friend and ally, his experience in corporate governance proving invaluable during the transformation process. 20 minutes later, with the aircraft comfortably established in cruise, Zoe made her way into the cabin. James Peterson sat exactly where she had been 6 months earlier, though his welcome from the cabin crew could not have been more different. Captain Washington, he greeted her warmly, extending his hand. Thought I'd surprise you. On my way to see my granddaughter in Charlotte. A wonderful surprise, Mr. Peterson. James, please. He gestured to the empty seat beside him. Got a minute? Zoe glanced toward the cockpit, where First Officer Johnson had things well in hand. A minute, she agreed, sitting briefly. I wanted you to know, Peterson said, his voice lowered confidentially, Sterling's new policies are being studied by 4 other major airlines. The independent committee structure, the transparency requirements, they're becoming industry standards. Zoe hadn't known this, focused as she'd been on her day-to-day responsibilities. That's remarkable. It's a beginning, Peterson corrected gently. The work is never finished, but the direction matters. He paused. My wife marched with me in Selma. Before she passed, she used to say change happens in unexpected moments, when someone with the courage to speak truth meets others with the wisdom to listen. The simple profundity of the statement resonated with Zoe. She thought of all the individuals who had found their voices in the wake of her stand, Trina Martinez, Captain Daniels, countless others who had stepped forward with their stories, their experiences, their determination to create something better. Thank you for being part of this, she told Peterson sincerely. Thank you for starting it, he replied. Now, you better get back to flying this plane. My granddaughter's waiting, and unlike some airlines I could name, Sterling Airways is known for its on-time arrivals these days. With a smile, Zoe returned to the cockpit, settling back into her captain's seat with the comfortable familiarity of belonging exactly where she was meant to be. Everything okay, Captain? Johnson asked. Everything's exactly as it should be, First Officer, she replied, checking their heading. Let's bring her home. As Flight 302 continued its journey through clear skies, Zoe Washington reflected on how a single moment of confrontation had cascaded into transformation, not through her actions alone, but through the collective courage of all those who had seized the opportunity to stand for change. The incident that had begun with a flight attendant's hand on her shoulder had rippled outward to touch thousands of lives. A coffee stain had become a catalyst. A moment of humiliation had become a movement for justice. And through it all, she had remained exactly who she had always been, Captain Zoe Washington, pilot, sister, daughter, changemaker, finally recognized not despite her identity but as her complete, authentic self. #the lessons we can learn. The story of Captain Zoe Washington teaches us that true change often begins with a single moment of courage. When faced with discrimination, Zoe could have accepted the apology and compensation, taking the easier path. Instead, she recognized that her individual experience was part of a larger pattern affecting countless others. We learn that systems don't change themselves, people change systems. By standing firm in her dignity rather than accepting token gestures, Zoe created space for others to speak their truths. Her story shows that meaningful transformation requires both individual courage and collective action. The narrative reminds us that power structures often try to isolate those who challenge them, offering individual benefits to maintain the status quo. By keeping her focus on systemic change rather than personal gain, Zoe achieved something far more valuable than a promotion. Perhaps most importantly, we see that change ripples outward in ways we can't predict. What began as a confrontation on one flight eventually transformed an entire industry's practices. Bradley Wilson's transformation shows that even those who perpetuate discrimination can grow when forced to confront their biases. This story challenges us all to consider, where in our lives are we accepting injustice as just the way things are? When might our individual stand create space for collective change? And how can we ensure that our actions serve not just our own interests, but the greater good? What's a time you witnessed or experienced discrimination and either spoke up or wished you had? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might give someone else the courage to stand up next time. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives about overcoming injustice. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that one person's courage can ignite widespread change. Thank you for joining me in exploring Captain Washington's journey. Remember, sometimes the most powerful words aren't complex speeches or elaborate arguments, they're simply enough and not anymore.